I'd like to pay my respects to the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nations, also to their neighbours not far from here, the Bunurong peoples. For a lot of people, we understand that the city is a shared space between Bunurong and Wurundjeri peoples, but both of the Kulin Nations, which extends pretty much for most of Victoria over 5 different nation groups, which are the Djajawarang, the Woiwurrung, the Wathaurong, the Bunurong, and the Woiwurrung as well. As Joseph alluded to, where is it? Oh, she mentioned that my family are Webber, Bangladesh, Mara and Calabrese, and I heard someone go, ooh. Sorry. No, don't be sorry. Both cultures in my families are both very expressive and loud and talkative. There's a lot of hand language, sign language, there's a lot of food, there's a lot of yelling, fighting, arguing, loving and debating. So the 2 things that very much gel my 2 families together. This is a work that I have on display in the exhibition, so I'm here sort of both as a speaker, an academic artist and curator, and an arts activist. So I've been making work my entire life to make sense of the stories, some of the stories that I was just sharing with you about growing up with an Aboriginal mother and an absent Italian father. So my parents separated when I was very small, and my mother raised me in her community and her culture, but she would send me to visit my father in Footscray. So you can imagine from the age of 5 getting put on a bus with a little notepad and a pen and being told to sit behind the driver and here's $5, and when you get to Heathcote, buy yourself a cup of tea and a sandwich, and then make sure you get back on the bus because your father's going to be waiting for you at Flinders Street. And that's what I would do from the age of 5. So my observation skills became quite sharp. I became very, very independent. And so this work was really about seeing myself, understanding also transgenerational trauma, which is unfortunately very common for Indigenous peoples throughout the world, but in particularly here. So in regards to people who have experienced the Holocaust via their grandparents, as in 3rd generation survivors, who may not have experienced those horrors firsthand, they've found through studies that the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors are actually carrying post-traumatic stress disorder themselves without having experienced it, and sometimes without the grandparents sharing the stories of those horrors, and yet the grandchildren are carrying that in their genes. Now if you think about that, what that means for us as Indigenous people in this country, carrying it for over 240 odd years, and ongoing injustices of incarceration and ongoing violence. And at the moment, many of our community are protesting the Commonwealth Games, which we refer to as the Stolen Wealth Games. So terminology is very important to think about when you're resisting and disrupting the state. Which I know in Italy there's a great culture of questioning authority and staking your claim about your people and about your tribal culture and how you understand that. So I feel both of those very strongly in my blood, even though my time with my father was limited and my time with my nonni was very limited. We would share stories through food and a lot of sign language, and I knew that they very, very much loved me. They had never met an Aboriginal person before they met my mother. So my parents got together in the early 1970s. This is them in one of Melbourne's finest nightclubs. You might recognise some of the old currency down at in the bottom of the table. This is my father. I shan't name him because he's got a lot of friends in Carlton. But if you recognise him, greetings. And this is my mother. So they had me a year or 2 later in 1974, and they ran a couple of clubs together, and it was at the time that the 6 o'clock spill laws, 6 o'clock closing laws were still in place, and my father's generation didn't believe in drinking in pubs, and so had clubs and places to play cards and gather and socialise, and my mother played a very minor role in that, because not only not being an Italian woman, as an Aboriginal woman with Chinese blood as well, my mother's surname is Tang, her name is Maggie and his name is Charlie. She she didn't follow the same rules that my father expected an Italian woman to follow. But he also understood that by choosing a non-Italian woman, he was up for a bit of a challenge outside of the rules that he thought she would abide by. He tried to apply them to her, but she she refused, which is why I call it Mum and Dad or Italy versus Australia. I adore sport and football and, Aussie rules and football. I was going to say soccer. But it was a combative relationship, and it was a very difficult one, and it was one in which my mother refused to continue to endure the transgenerational violence that she'd already experienced. She was already traumatised. She'd already experienced rape, as had my grandmother and my great-grandmother, by non-Aboriginal men. And that's a reality of frontier violence in this country. It was perpetrated to a great extent against Aboriginal women. And so when she encountered my father, she refused to obey him. And so it set up a very feisty relationship. In which she, in the end, left Dad, left our little place in Footscray, my birthplace, and took me up to the country. So that's where I was raised with my Aboriginal grandmother Rosie and the whole extended family. So I had a number of mothers, a number of grandmothers, a number of aunties, some of whom are actually my first cousins. So there's different kinship rules in Aboriginal culture that your mother's first cousins are also your aunties. And so there's a lot of people responsible for you, and you're responsible for a lot of people and other children as well. So my yearly visits, I would come down from the countries with my brother and I, and my brother's from another relationship, from another culture altogether. And my mother worked very hard as a single mother, and so the majority of her work was picking tomatoes, potatoes. She worked in the canneries in the Goulburn Valley with my grandmother and aunties, often alongside Italian women in those factories. And my grandmother and great auntie would become very jealous and emotional because they couldn't speak their own language. They were hearing Italian women speaking in their languages and dialects, and they felt a great sense of grief and loss about that. And so they challenged their grandmother, their mother at the time, my great-grandmother. This is our Wimper country, our matriarchal country. This is my great-grandmother I'm speaking about in the middle, Nanny Nancy. She was known by the linguist Louise Hercus in 1961 as being the last of the full speakers of Wimper language. From her recordings with her and her brother, my uncle Stanley, she created the Wimper Dictionary, which now sits in AAPSIS, which is the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Research Archive in Canberra. And they challenged her and they said, "Why didn't you teach us our language?" And she said, "You were just better off knowing English. You were safer." Because it meant they were less of a target, and it meant that she believed that they might be able to survive a little better in this colonial system. That's my papa, that's my great-grandmother on the far end, and my grandmother Rosie here, who's an artist and influenced me to become an artist. That's some of her work in the background. My mother and grandmother were very, very keen that I stay in touch with my nonni and with my father and with my Italian family, particularly because of the racism I faced in our community. There was misunderstandings on both sides, from white children, other Aboriginal children and Italian children. I had an Italian cousin, an Aboriginal cousin, who would laugh and point at me and say to his white friends, "You know that she's Italian and she doesn't even like spaghetti?" And I said to him, "I will not eat that tinned crap if you paid me." So his spaghetti was the Heinz, the tinned slop. And I'd eaten my grandmother's pasta, so there was no way I was going to touch that stuff. So I very much inherited Italian Calabrese taste buds. But there were all these strange projections onto me about what I was or wasn't. I would go to a lot of Italian weddings when I'd visit Dad, and my beautiful auntie and uncle who absolutely hold me up. And as you can see, my uncle is holding up. His wife had been married for 50 years and run a business for 30 years. And they were my absolute rock. So in the absence of my parents being together and having that stability and financial security, they were absolutely there for me. So there'd be times in the holidays when I'd be visiting my father and I'd spend more time with them and their kids became like my big siblings. My cousin, Paola, their daughter, there are 5 of us, named after our nonna. she would say to me that she wanted to be Aboriginal and she wanted to swap with me and go home on the bus instead of me, and I would stay with her in Avondale Heights, which I thought sounded fantastic because they would go shopping at High Point and Sports Girl and Maya, whereas my clothes came from the op shop and my mother made them, you know, and when she could afford them she'd buy me something new, which horrified my father because he said, no, someone could have died in those things. So this level of suspicion, and I was like, Dad, they wouldn't sell them if somebody died in them, they'd be burnt somewhere, they'd be gone. But the level of cultural suspicion and spirituality very strong in both. But you know, my mum was doing the best she could, so it became a battle about all of those issues. My art practice very much became a place for me to narrate everything I was going through, because this sense of belonging and not belonging all at once. I've travelled the world with my work and artwork, and in countries I go to, in India for example, I was with the Hilli people, who are Indigenous people. There are millions of Indigenous people in India who are fighting for their language and culture, and the Hilli people really took me in, and a Hilli auntie believed that I was a Hilli woman, and I had to really work hard to convince her that I wasn't. In New York in January, Latinx people thought that I might be Spanish and spoke to me in Spanish. So I feel this incredible belonging, because when people can't place your face, they do this thing where they try to project onto you some sort of belonging, and I've got aunties and great aunties on both sides, Italian and Aboriginal, that'll say, you look like your grandmother when you were a little girl. And they're talking about both of my grandmothers. You know, and that's because it's true. Two things can be true at once. It's very challenging when you're dealing with racism and the sense of not being white enough for some people, not being black enough for others, and the grief of not knowing language. So my work is often commentary on history in this country in particular. I Know What You Did Last Century. It's a play on a film, I Know What You Did Last Summer, where I place historical objects from museums that I've curated in and art exhibitions, and reference Aboriginal, so-called Aboriginal experts around anthropology and art history, and often collaborate with other people. So this is an image that was deliberately taken to exclude her head. This is of Tracy Bundo, Professor Tracy Bundo, who's a Waka Waka Nui woman from University of Southern Queensland. She's one of my supervisors in my PhD. And she invited me to photograph that scar on her chest after she'd had open heart surgery after a heart attack. It was about raising awareness about Aboriginal health and the statistics around our lower life expectancy and health standards. My curatorial work is really important to me because I love to collaborate with others, and like I said, it's been taking me around the world recently, including New York, Manhattan, which is Lenape-Hoking country, and I was invited there to be a part of First Nations dialogues in which we met with First Nations artists and practitioners and visual artists from New York City who've been, you know, contributing to the visual art scene there and performance art for a very long time, and I was honoured to be invited to speak at Performance Space New York, which was very exciting, and talk about decolonising practices. Again, this is some more images from the Sovereignty exhibition that was mentioned earlier. Some of the artists you want to scarce. So the notions of what Aboriginal art is, I'm very interested in challenging. This is Aboriginal art because an Aboriginal person made it. You know, it doesn't have to be covered in dots and made by someone sitting on the ground. We're about challenging the conceptions, misconceptions and misappropriations about what it means to make Indigenous statements visually in this country. Ioane's work there is actually about the atomic testing that happened at Maralinga and has poisoned the ground generationally to the point that people are still sick there in that country, and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are sick from the atomic testing that the Australian government perpetuated on Aboriginal country and against white Australians as well. And there's some more work there from that exhibition. I'm sorry, I've gotten sidetracked because of the time thing. I don't know how far we're going.
2 more minutes.
Oh, thank you. So there's just some other images from the Sovereignty exhibition, which was at ACCA. So this was the first exhibition of Indigenous art that ever happened, that had happened at ACCA for 12 years. In the previous director's time, there wasn't a single Indigenous artist shown there, and it was the openly criticised oversight. And so the director, Max Delaney, and I brought together, speaking of the NGV, Max is a former NGV senior curator of contemporary art. We collaborated as, Aboriginal, non-Aboriginal collaboration to bring in over 40 Indigenous artists from southeastern Australia and make work about all sorts of things, historical works right up to the present. And so this is a display of banners from war, which is the Warriors of the Aboriginal Resistance. They are the people who've been coordinating the big marches that shut the city down and had 60,000 people show up on Invasion Day, otherwise known as Australia Day. So these are contested spaces, and for me it's contested in that I'm, second generation from my father first, but tens of thousands of generations from my mother's blood, So when you carry the settler blood as well as Indigenous blood, you have a responsibility to tell the truth to both families, and it's very difficult. It's easy sometimes to have a go at enemies. It's very hard to stand up to your family. It's much harder. So these are just some images of, again, my grandmother, mother and myself in front of my dad's Italian restaurant in Footscray, which he's had now for 44 years. And this is myself and my daughter and my son and my niece on one of the marches I mentioned. So these are just images, and there's some text here from my PhD project, which is predominantly a creative project. I'll be creating an exhibition next year that will be examined and writing an exegesis that theorises about the work of Aboriginal women as resistors, disruptors, protectors and nurturers, not just as activists, but as protecting country and protecting family and protecting children. And it's important to note that Aboriginal women are actually the highest incarcerated group in Australia right now. And I've visited Dame Phyllis Frost, which is in Deer Park. It's a maximum security centre for women in the state. The majority of Aboriginal women in there have been abused as children. They've gone through domestic violence, and they're in there for things like not being able to pay parking fines. Very menial crimes. And if they can't get a job, if they can't get a house within 12 months of their release, they lose their children permanently. The majority of them have children. So these are very archaic laws that are actually deliberately discriminating against Aboriginal people, and these were all found and established from the Royal Inquiry into Aboriginal deaths in custody. The majority of those recommendations have never been implemented. The statistics have actually gotten worse. So it's why I'm very passionate about my research, and the exhibition will highlight Aboriginal women's status as marginalised and subjected to violence, but also to create an archive of their work, because often in a patriarchal society, men's stories are more easily palatable and told, and men are often heroicised in Aboriginal cultures as well. So all of it is situated around Professor Morton Robinson and her work about relationality and her standpoint theory on Aboriginal feminist standpoint, which is really fascinating work. And I get to be in the same space as Professor Gary Foley, who's a renowned activist, all-round good guy, a lot of fun to be around, and an incredible wealth of knowledge. His Aboriginal Black Power and History archive is at Victoria University in the same building that I have my PhD office in. It's where I lecture, and it's where I conduct my research with an incredible team, including Tony Birch. It's led by a woman called Karen Jackson, who's been there for over 20 years and has fought very hard for us to hold a space within the university. And it's difficult because universities are sites of colonial power, and we need to contest them. The other thing that we do that really excites me is that we invite in all other, as in other, people who don't fit into an Anglo sort of stereotypical student. They're very welcome with us. We have a young Italian anarchist working with us at the moment, looking at the treaty process. We have people of varying cultures and backgrounds, young people of colour that find a safe place to study with us. So this is some of my details, so thank you for persevering. The gremlins were playing with that, but thank you.